Was he a national hero or a bloodthirsty tyrant? The savior who ended a century of chaos, or the butcher who massacred his own countrymen? A warrior who stood defiant against Imperial Japan, or the great loser of the 20th century's most monumental war? History records the name Chiang Kai-shek with two violently contradictory faces. For nearly a quarter of a century, Chiang Kai-shek personified China. He was the commander-in-chief who unified a broken nation, stood shoulder to shoulder with world leaders like Roosevelt and Churchill, and fought the two most powerful forces of the age, Japanese imperialism and global communism. But he was also a man who lost everything. His corrupt and brutal regime collapsed in one of the most spectacular defeats in modern history, turning his name into a symbol of lost China. This is not just the story of one man's life. It is a journey into the heart of modern China's greatest and most tragic contradiction. It's the story of a man who climbed to the absolute pinnacle of power, only to be cast into the abyss of failure, leaving behind a legacy so controversial that even today it remains an unfinished argument. On the great chessboard of history, who was Chiang Kai-shek? To understand the man who both built and broke a nation, we must first travel back to the desperate, dying empire that created him. The China of 1887 was not a proud, celestial empire of the world's imagination. It was a dying beast, a magnificent but hollow vessel being picked apart by wolves, both foreign and domestic. This era of decline is known in China as the Century of Humiliation, a period of national trauma that began not with a bang, but with the insidious, sweet-smelling smoke of opium. By the 1830s, the British East India Company, seeking to reverse a massive trade deficit caused by Europe's insatiable appetite for Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk, began flooding the southern port of Canton with opium grown in their Indian colonies. The drug, once a curiosity for the elite, became a plague upon the nation. Millions became addicted, their bodies and wills wasting away. Vast quantities of silver, the lifeblood of the Chinese economy, flowed out of the country to pay for the poison, and the very fabric of society began to fray. When the Qing Emperor's commissioner, a resolute official named Lin Zexu, defiantly seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium in 1839, he sparked a war China could not win. The First Opium War was a catastrophic awakening. China's traditional armies, armed with spears, matchlock guns, and a deep-seated belief in their own cultural superiority, were systematically annihilated by a small British expeditionary force equipped with modern percussion cap rifles and steam-powered gunboats. The British ironclad warship, the Nemesis, sailed up China's ancient rivers with impunity, shattering the myth of the Middle Kingdom's invincibility. The resulting Treaty of Nanking in 1842 was the first and most infamous of the unequal treaties. The terms were crippling. China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, open 5 major treaty ports to foreign trade, and pay a massive indemnity that would bankrupt the imperial treasury. Most humiliating of all was the principle of extraterritoriality, which meant that foreigners in China were subject to their own laws, not Chinese ones. They could commit crimes on Chinese soil and be judged by their own consuls. They were ghosts in the Chinese system, untouchable and unaccountable. This external humiliation was mirrored by a cataclysmic internal decay. From 1850 to 1864, the southern half of the country was consumed by the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history. Led by a charismatic Hakka mystic named Hong Xiuquan, who after a nervous breakdown declared himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, The rebellion sought to establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace. It was a bizarre, fanatical, and brutally violent crusade against both the demonic Manchu rulers and the entire Confucian tradition. Before it was finally crushed with the help of Western-trained mercenary armies, the rebellion cost an estimated 20 to 30 million lives, more than the entire First World War, and utterly devastated the fertile heartland of the Yangtze River Delta. The Qing court, led by the shrewd but deeply conservative Dowager Empress Cixi, responded to this dual crisis of external invasion and internal rebellion with a series of halting, contradictory reforms. The self-strengthening movement sought to adopt Western technology, guns, ships, railways, while preserving the core of Confucian culture. The guiding slogan was Chinese learning as the essence, Western learning for practical use. But it was a doomed effort. The reforms were piecemeal, crippled by court corruption and a profound cultural arrogance that prevented a true embrace of the political and social changes that had made Western technology so powerful in the first place. The ultimate soul-crushing proof of this failure came in 1895. Japan, a nation China had long regarded as a little brother and cultural pupil, had in a single generation undergone a stunningly rapid and thorough modernization during its Meiji Restoration. When war broke out with China over influence in Korea, the result was a shock of seismic proportions. China's brand new expensive navy, the pride of the self-strengthening movement, was obliterated by the Japanese fleet at the Battle of the Yalu River. Its armies were routed. The ensuing Treaty of Shimonoseki was even more humiliating than those signed with the Western powers. China was forced to recognize the independence of Korea, cede the island of Taiwan to Japan, and pay another crippling indemnity. To be defeated by the powerful British was one thing. To be utterly crushed by a small Asian neighbor was a psychological trauma from which the dynasty would never recover. It was into this vortex of humiliation, confusion, and despair, a nation on its knees, its ancient pride in tatters, its ports controlled by foreigners, and its people drowning in opium and poverty, that Chiang Kai-shek was born. But he was not born into the world of the humiliated peasantry. He was born into a family that, for a time, had found a way to prosper amidst the decay. On October 31st, 1887, in the small picturesque town of Jiku in the coastal province of Zhejiang, a boy was born to a family of prosperous salt merchants. His birth name was Zhang Ruyuan. The Zhang family, part of the local gentry, had built a comfortable fortune from their licensed trade in salt, a government-monopolized commodity, along with a winery and other small enterprises. In a time of widespread famine and hardship, Chang's childhood was, on the surface, one of relative comfort. He would never know the sting of true hunger. But this surface tranquility was shattered in 1895, when Chiang was just 8 years old. His father, Zhang Zhaokong, died suddenly from typhoid fever. In an instant, the family's world collapsed. In the patriarchal, often predatory society of late Imperial China, a family without a strong male head was vulnerable prey. The comfortable fortune his father had built became a target for the greed of the extended clan. His older half-brother began to siphon off the family assets, while other relatives descended like vultures, demanding repayment of old debts and bullying the young widow and her son. The family that had been respected local gentry was now on the verge of ruin. In this desperate situation, the person who stood up and held the family together was his mother, Wang Kaiyu. A devout Buddhist and a woman steeped in the stern virtues of Confucianism, she was no delicate flower. She was a woman of iron will, determined to protect her son and his inheritance at all costs. She fought off the relatives, managed the family business with an iron fist, and raised her son with a love that was more severe than tender. Her lessons were not of comfort, but of survival. She drilled into him the Confucian values of filial piety, discipline, and, above all, an unyielding will to overcome adversity. Years later in his memoirs, Chiang would recall her influence with a telling metaphor. My mother's love was not like the sunshine of spring, but like the cold wind of winter. It was because of that cold wind that I was able to grow roots that no trial could break. This severe upbringing had a profound and lasting impact on his character. It forged in him a remarkable self-discipline, a stoic endurance, and an obsession with order and control. But it also planted the seeds of a deep-seated suspicion of others, a belief that the world was a hostile place where one had to be constantly vigilant against betrayal. The early loss of his father and the powerful, almost suffocating presence of his mother may have shaped his future leadership style, authoritarian, paternalistic, and demanding absolute, unquestioning loyalty. The loss of his father also fueled an intense craving for power. Physically small and slight, he was often bullied by other village boys. He found his escape not in play, but in the pages of classic Chinese historical novels like Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin. He spent hours reading epic tales of heroic generals, cunning strategists, and loyal warriors who brought order to a chaotic world. He dreamed of one day commanding great armies, of becoming a man so powerful that no one would ever dare to look down on him or his family again. The military was not just a career path. It was his fantasy, his escape, the ultimate expression of the power he craved. At the age of 14, in 1901, another shackle was placed upon him, one that represented everything he was beginning to despise about the old world. His mother, following traditional custom, arranged his marriage to a girl from a neighboring village named Mao Fu-mei. It was a deeply unhappy match from the start. She was 5 years his senior, illiterate, and her feet had been painfully bound into the tiny golden lotuses that were the mark of a traditional woman. To the ambitious, restless young Chiang, who was just beginning to be exposed to modern ideas at a new school in Ningbo, this marriage was a humiliation. His wife, in his eyes, represented everything he sought to escape, the old feudal and backward China. Though she would later give birth in 1910 to his first and most important son, Chang Ching-kuo, the marriage was devoid of affection. It was a duty, not a partnership. This unhappy first union seems to have bred in him a contempt for traditional bonds and may have been the starting point for a complex and often callous personal life that would include several other wives and concubines. A true turning point came in 1906. Now a 19-year-old consumed by the new spirit of Chinese nationalism, Chiang made a dramatic and dangerous gesture of rebellion. He took a pair of scissors and cut off his queue, the long braided pigtail that all Han Chinese men were forced to wear as a symbol of their submission to the Manchu Qing dynasty. In the eyes of the government, this was an act of treason, a declaration of revolution. It was Chiang's personal break with the past, a vow to join the forces that sought to expel the Manchus and restore China. That same year, he took his first concrete step towards his military dream, enrolling in the Beijing Military Academy, one of China's first modern military schools. But the crumbling institution of the old empire was too small for his ambitions. His gaze, like that of many aspiring young nationalists, was fixed across the sea on the island nation of Japan. Japan, which had so recently humiliated China, was now the model to be emulated. It had successfully modernized, built a powerful army, and had even defeated a great Western power, Russia, in 1905. To Chiang, Japan held the secret to the strength his own nation so desperately needed. He was determined to learn it. In 1907, Chiang Kai-shek finally realized his dream, traveling to Japan on a government scholarship to enroll in the Tokyo Shinbugakko, a preparatory military school for Chinese students. His time in Japan, which would last until 1911, was a crucible, forging him into a completely different man. He threw himself into his studies with a maniacal intensity, mastering not just military science, but also the Japanese language, physics, and chemistry. He was determined to absorb every ounce of knowledge that had made this small island nation so powerful. He was profoundly influenced by the Japanese military ethos, particularly the spirit of Bushido, the samurai code of discipline, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. He admired the Spartan lifestyle, the absolute obedience to superiors, and the belief that death in service of a greater cause was the highest honor. He saw this iron discipline as the antidote to the corruption, lethargy, and individualism that he believed plagued his own country. He resolved to become a Chinese samurai, a modern warrior who could forge a new, disciplined soul for his nation. But his time in Japan was also a period of deep and constant humiliation. He was a citizen of a weak, defeated nation, looked down upon by his Japanese instructors and peers. This sense of national shame fueled his patriotism, transforming it into a hard, aggressive, and sometimes xenophobic nationalism. His revolutionary fervor, once a vague ideal, now had a sharp, bitter edge. It was in this hothouse of revolutionary thought in Tokyo, a city teeming with exiled Chinese students and radicals, that he found his cause and his master. In 1908, through his friend and mentor Chen Qimei, a key figure in the Shanghai Revolutionary Underground, Chiang was inducted into the Tongmenghui, or the Revolutionary Alliance, the secret society led by the charismatic Sun Yat-sen. This was the moment he officially stepped into the dangerous and intoxicating world of revolution. He was still a minor figure, an unknown cadet, but the young wolf had found his pack. He began to learn the ruthless arts of survival in the clandestine world of secret societies, where loyalty was everything and betrayal was a death sentence. The boy from the salt merchant's family was gone. The revolutionary Chiang Kai-shek was being born. On October 10, 1911, a single gunshot in the city of Wuchang ignited the flames of revolution. The Xinhai Revolution, the culmination of years of plotting by Sun Yat-sen and his followers, spread across China like wildfire. Province after province declared independence from the crumbling Qing dynasty. When the news reached Japan, the 24-year-old Chiang Kai-shek, now serving his required time as an enlisted man in the Imperial Japanese Army, did not hesitate. This was the moment he had been training for his entire life. He deserted his post and, along with his friend Chen Qimei, rushed back to China to join the fight. He arrived in Shanghai, the revolution's chaotic epicenter, and was immediately thrown into battle as a commander of an artillery regiment under Chen's command. For the first time, he tasted real combat, leading men, giving orders, and experiencing the exhilarating, brutal calculus of war. The revolution succeeded. The last emperor abdicated. The 2,000-year-old imperial system was dead, but the joy was short-lived. The newborn Republic of China was almost immediately stillborn, descending into the even greater nightmare of the warlord era. The revolution's political fruits were hijacked by Yuan Shikai, a powerful and ambitious general who betrayed the Republic and attempted to make himself emperor. After his death, the country shattered. For the next decade, China was a patchwork of territories ruled by ambitious generals who commanded private armies, printed their own currency, and fought endless destructive wars against each other. For Chiang Kai-shek, the warlord era was not a period of chaos, it was a university of violence, and he graduated with a single brutal degree. He learned that in a broken world, a constitution is just a piece of paper, an ideal is just a breath of hot air, and the only argument that truly matters is the one made from the barrel of a gun. He came to believe, with an almost religious conviction, that only a man with an iron will and an invincible army could crush the warlords and forge the fragmented nation back into one piece. He would be that man. In this lawless, dog-eat-dog world, Chiang sharpened his own claws and teeth. He learned to be ruthless, cunning, and to seize every opportunity. His chilling capacity for political violence was first revealed in 1912. His mentor, Chen Shimei, was locked in a bitter power struggle with another prominent revolutionary leader, Tao Ching-jung. One night, Tao was assassinated in his hospital bed. The evidence pointed to Chen Shimei. Just as the investigation was closing in, the young Chiang Kai-shek stepped forward and took the blame, a stunning act of loyalty. It was a calculated gamble. He knew the chaotic new government would be reluctant to prosecute a decorated young revolutionary officer. He was right. The case was dropped. This audacious act paid off handsomely. He earned Chen Shimei's undying trust and was seen within revolutionary circles as a man of supreme loyalty, willing to risk his own life for his leader. He had turned a sordid assassination into a political asset. During this period, living in the murky underworld of Shanghai, often on the run from Yuan Shikai's agents, Chiang forged another crucial and deeply compromising alliance. He realized that to survive and to fund his revolutionary activities, he needed more than just political connections. He needed the power of the streets. He allied himself with Shanghai's most powerful criminal organization, the Green Gang. Led by the notorious gangster bosses Wang Jinrong and the even more powerful Du Yuesheng, the Green Gang was a vast criminal empire built on opium trafficking, gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering. They were the unofficial rulers of Shanghai's underworld. To them, Chiang Kai-shek, a rising military figure with powerful political connections, was a valuable asset. To Chiang, the Green Gang offered a ready source of funds, safe houses, and, most importantly, a legion of ruthless street fighters who could be mobilized at a moment's notice. This was a devil's bargain. The alliance between the revolutionary and the gangster would have profound and devastating consequences. It was the seed of the institutionalized corruption and the reliance on brute force that would ultimately rot Chiang's government from the inside out. He had decided that to save China, he must be willing to embrace its darkest forces. For him, the end always justified the means. In 1916, his mentor Chen Shimei was assassinated. Chiang, as his most loyal protege, inherited his political network, becoming a key figure among the right-wing conservative faction of the KMT. His power was growing. His personal life, however, was becoming even more complicated and, according to some accounts, darker. In 1921, he took a second wife, a beautiful and vivacious young woman named Chen Jeru. Years later, in a controversial memoir, she would claim that Chiang had infected her with a venereal disease he had contracted during his wilder days, rendering her infertile. The claim, though disputed by his supporters, painted a picture of a man whose public image of stern, ascetic discipline was a carefully constructed facade, hiding a private life of reckless indulgence and its painful consequences. By the early 1920s, Sun Yat-sen's struggling revolutionary government, based in the southern city of Guangzhou, was in desperate need of allies. The Western democracies, wary of the chaos in China, offered little support. In his desperation, Sun turned to the only other revolutionary power in the world, the newly formed Soviet Union. Moscow, eager to spread communist revolution in Asia, agreed to provide Sun with money, weapons, and political advisors. This marked the beginning of the First United Front, a strange and ultimately doomed alliance between the nationalists and the fledgling Chinese Communist Party. In 1923, Sun dispatched his most trusted young military expert on a crucial mission to travel to Moscow and study the Soviet political and military system. That man was Chiang Kai-shek. His 3 months in the heart of the Bolshevik Revolution were a transformative experience, but not in the way Sun Yat-sen had intended. Chiang met with senior Soviet leaders, including Leon Trotsky. He studied the organization of the Red Army and the brutal efficiency of the Bolshevik party structure, and he was horrified. He saw in the Soviet system not a utopia of workers' liberation, but a terrifying totalitarian machine of absolute state control, secret police, and ruthless purges. He came to believe, with a deep and visceral conviction, that communism was a tyrannical ideology fundamentally incompatible with Chinese civilization. His lifelong, almost fanatical anti-communism was forged in the cold winter of Moscow. But he was also a pragmatist. He knew that for now he needed Soviet help, so he hid his true feelings. He praised the Bolsheviks, wrote glowing reports, and even agreed to send his own teenage son, Chiang Ching-kuo, to study in Moscow, effectively making him a political hostage to secure Stalin's trust. It was a chilling demonstration of his willingness to sacrifice even his own family for his political goals. Chiang returned from Moscow in 1924 with a mission that would become the cornerstone of his power. Sun Yat-sen, with Soviet funding and advisors, established the Whampoa Military Academy near Guangzhou. Its purpose was to create a new kind of Chinese soldier, a modern professional officer corps, loyal not to a regional warlord, but to the party and its revolutionary ideology. Sun appointed the 37-year-old Chiang Kai-shek as the Academy's first commandant. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, and Chiang seized it with both hands. He turned Whampoa into his personal kingdom, a crucible that would forge the elite of a new army. He was a demanding, almost fanatical leader, personally overseeing the cadets' training, drilling them in military tactics, and more importantly, political loyalty. He brilliantly balanced the competing factions, appointing a charismatic young communist named Zhou Enlai as the head of the political department to please his Soviet advisors, while simultaneously building his own secret right-wing network within the cadet corps. The cadets, young men drawn from all over China, came to see him not just as a commander, but as a mentor, a father figure, the embodiment of a new, disciplined, and powerful China. They developed an intense personal loyalty to him, a bond that would form the bedrock of his political power for the next 30 years. The Whampoa clique would become the ruling elite of his army and his government. He was no longer just a general. He was a leader of men, the master of his own private army. His power was now so indispensable that when he theatrically resigned over a dispute with his Soviet advisors, a panicked Sun Yat-sen had to personally plead with him to return. The message was clear. There could be no revolution without Chiang Kai-shek. But on March 12, 1925, the sun set on the first era of the Chinese Republic. Sun Yat-sen, the undisputed father of the nation, died of liver cancer in Beijing. His last despairing words, a prophecy. The revolution is not yet complete. His death left a colossal power vacuum. The Kuomintang, a fractious coalition of idealists, militarists, and political opportunists, held together only by Sun's immense prestige, was suddenly leaderless. And at the center of this looming conflict stood the wolf from Shiku, the man who had been given the keys to the kingdom, the guns. The father of the nation was gone, and the merciless struggle for his inheritance was about to begin. The leading contenders were powerful political figures with national reputations. There was Wang Jingwei, a brilliant orator and Sun's longtime associate, the charismatic leader of the KMT's left wing. There was Liao Zhongkai, another key leftist, and the man who controlled the party's finances, a crucial position in the cash-strapped revolutionary government. And there was Hu Hanmin, the respected elder statesman and leader of the party's conservative right wing. Compared to these political heavyweights, Chiang Kai-shek, the commandant of the Whampoa Military Academy, was seen as a secondary figure, a military man with little political experience or intellectual heft. No one imagined that this dour, uncharismatic soldier could outmaneuver them all to claim the ultimate prize. But Chiang possessed one thing his rivals lacked: an army. He had spent the last year forging the Whampoa cadets into a force loyal not to the party, not to the revolution, but to him personally. He understood a truth that his more idealistic colleagues did not. In the brutal game for control of China, the man with the most guns would ultimately write the rules. He would not debate his way to power, he would conquer it. The power struggle began not with a speech, but with a gunshot. In August 1925, just 5 months after Sun's death, the powerful leftist leader Liao Zhongkai was assassinated in broad daylight as he arrived for a party meeting in Guangzhou. The assassination sent shock waves through the party. An investigation immediately pointed to a conspiracy within the KMT's right wing, and the primary suspect was Hu Hanmin. Under intense pressure from the party's left wing and their Soviet advisors, Hu Hanmin was forced to take political responsibility and was effectively exiled. In a single stroke, 2 of Chiang's most powerful competitors for power had been eliminated from the board. In the ensuing chaos and confusion, Chiang Kai-shek made his move. Presenting himself as the only man who could restore order and discipline, he used his Whampoa cadets to impose martial law, investigate the assassination, and in the process, purge several of his military rivals within the Guangzhou government. He was not the prime suspect, but he was the primary beneficiary. The wolf was patiently eliminating the other predators in the pack. Now, only the popular and powerful Wang Jingwei stood in his way. On March 20th, 1926, Chiang Kai-shek executed his most audacious and risky power play yet. In an event that remains shrouded in mystery and controversy, known as the Canton Coup, or the Zhongshan gunboat incident, he claimed to have uncovered a plot by communists and their Soviet advisors to kidnap him aboard the gunboat Zhongshan and ship him off to exile in Russia. Whether the plot was real, a misunderstanding, or a complete fabrication of Chiang's own paranoid imagination is still fiercely debated by historians. But what is certain is that he used the alleged plot as a pretext to launch a swift and decisive military coup against the left wing of his own party. In a single night, his troops, led by loyal Whampoa graduates, moved with brutal efficiency. They surrounded the residences of the Soviet advisors, placing them under house arrest. They disarmed the Communists' own small armed forces, the Canton Hong Kong Strike Committee, and they rounded up and arrested dozens of Communist commissars who were serving within his own army, including for a time a young political operative named Zhou Enlai. It was a stunning act of defiance against the KMT's left wing and a direct challenge to his Soviet patrons who had armed and funded him. It was a declaration that he, and he alone, was in charge. The political leader of the government, Wang Jingwei, was completely outmaneuvered and utterly powerless. He had the political titles, but Chiang had the guns. Faced with Chiang's military fait accompli and perhaps fearing for his own life, Wang pleaded illness, resigned from all his posts, and fled into a comfortable exile in France. The last major obstacle to Chiang's absolute power had been removed from the board. The coup was a masterstroke of political hardball. It effectively neutered the communist influence within the KMT, shattered the power of the party's left wing, and made it brutally clear that the army, Chiang's army, was now the supreme authority in the land. The principle of civilian control over the military, a cornerstone of Sun Yat-sen's vision, was dead. Surprisingly, Stalin, from his distant perch in Moscow, chose to swallow the humiliation. He still needed Chiang and his army to fight the northern warlords, a goal that served Soviet strategic interests. He ordered the Chinese communists to accept the new reality and continue the uneasy alliance. Chiang had gambled that his military power made him indispensable to everyone, and he had won. With all his rivals either dead, exiled, or intimidated into submission, Chiang Kai-shek was now the undisputed military and political leader of the Kuomintang. The stage was set for him to realize the dream that Sun Yat-sen had left unfinished, the conquest of the northern warlords and the unification of China. In July 1926, Chiang Kai-shek, now the commander-in-chief of the National Revolutionary Army, launched the Northern Expedition. It was the great military campaign that would define his legacy and make his name known across the world. Leading an army of 100,000 men, he marched out of his base in Guangzhou with a single grand objective: to crush the warlords who had carved up northern China into their personal fiefdoms and to nominally unify the nation under a single flag for the first time in a generation. The expedition, at least in its initial phase, was a spectacular success. The southern armies, well trained at Whampoa and fired with revolutionary zeal that the warlords' mercenary troops lacked, swept north like a storm. They were aided by communist-led peasant uprisings and labor strikes that destabilized the warlord regimes from within. One by one, the great warlords of the north, men who had ruled like feudal kings for a decade, were defeated and their armies scattered. Major cities like Wuhan, Shanghai, and Nanjing fell to the advancing revolutionary forces. Chiang Kai-shek's name became a symbol of hope across China. He was no longer just a party-strong man. He was a national hero, the savior who was finally ending the long, dark night of the warlord era. His strategy was a brilliant and cynical combination of military force and political cunning. He was a master of what he called silver bullets, bribery. He fought his enemies not just on the battlefield, but in their own camps. Before launching an attack, he would often send agents with suitcases full of cash to buy the loyalty of his opponent's subordinate commanders. He skillfully played one warlord against another, exploiting their rivalries and encouraging them to fight amongst themselves. Only after he had weakened his enemies through political intrigue and bribery would he deliver the final decisive military blow. It was a demonstration of the cold, cynical realism that would become the hallmark of his rule. He understood that in China's Game of Thrones, loyalty was a commodity that could be bought and sold. But as the expedition advanced towards the wealthy industrial heartland of the Yangtze River Delta, the fragile, forced alliance between the KMT's right wing, led by Chiang, and its left wing and communist allies began to completely unravel. The left wing of the KMT, along with their Soviet advisors, established a rival nationalist government in the industrial city of Wuhan, openly challenging Chiang's authority and accusing him of becoming a military dictator. To Chiang, this was an act of unforgivable betrayal, a communist-inspired plot to stab him in the back at his moment of triumph. His long-simmering anti-communism, forged in Moscow and hardened in the power struggles of Guangzhou, was about to erupt into a firestorm of unimaginable violence. On April 12, 1927, in the city of Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek made the most ruthless and fateful decision of his life. He unleashed a wave of terror that would forever stain his name and plunge China into decades of civil war. Shanghai was a stronghold of the Communist Party and its powerful, well-organized labor unions. As Chiang's army approached the city, the unions, led by a young Zhou Enlai, had launched a general strike and an armed uprising, effectively seizing control of the city from the local warlord and welcoming the nationalist army as liberators. They had no idea they were welcoming their executioners. Chiang had made another devil's bargain. He secretly reactivated his old alliance with the Shanghai underworld, the Green Gang. He made a deal with the crime boss Du Yuesheng. In the pre-dawn hours of April 12th, thousands of Green Gang thugs, armed with clubs, meat cleavers, knives, and guns, and wearing armbands identifying them as workers, launched a coordinated surprise attack on the headquarters of the labor unions and communist cells across the city. The communists and union members, caught completely off guard, were slaughtered in their beds and in the streets. What followed was a city-wide purge. The KMT army then moved in, hunting down anyone suspected of being a communist. People were arrested, tortured, and executed on the spot. The streets ran with blood. This was the White Terror, a brutal campaign of political extermination that quickly spread to other cities under Chiang's control. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly, but it is believed that tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 300,000 people, were killed across China in the purge of 1927. The fledgling Chinese Communist Party was nearly wiped out. The first united front was shattered in an act of spectacular treachery. The survivors, including Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, were forced to flee to the remote countryside, their dream of an urban proletarian revolution dead. From this moment on, they would be Chiang's mortal enemies, locked in a struggle to the death. Chiang had won. He had crushed his internal rivals and consolidated his power, but in doing so, he had started a fire that would eventually consume him and his republic. In the bloody aftermath of the purge, with his power now seemingly absolute, Chiang Kai-shek made one final, brilliant move to legitimize his new regime and consolidate his victory. In December 1927, he married Sung Mei-ling. This was no simple love match. It was the most significant political and financial merger in modern Chinese history. By marrying Mei-ling, Chiang secured three invaluable assets. He gained access to the immense financial resources of the Sung family. He gained a direct dynastic link to the hallowed legacy of Sun Yat-sen, and he gained a perfect American-educated ambassador to the Western world. The wedding of the century was a declaration. It announced the formation of a new ruling dynasty for China, a powerful alliance of military might, financial power, and international connection. To seal the deal, Chiang, the devout Buddhist, had promised to study Christianity. He had cast off his old wives and his old allegiances. By 1928, the Northern Expedition was complete. Through a brilliant military campaign and a brutal bloody purge, Chiang Kai-shek had reached the pinnacle. His marriage to the American-educated Sung Mei-ling had created a new dynasty, fusing his military might with the Sung family's immense wealth and international connections. The salt merchant's son had become a new kind of emperor. the undisputed leader of 400 million people. But he had unified China with blood and betrayal, and his new kingdom was a house of cards, built on treacherous foundations. From within, it was beset by corruption and the simmering rage of the communists he had failed to destroy. And from without, a far greater threat was gathering on the horizon: Imperial Japan. The Generalissimo would now face his greatest test, a brutal 8-year struggle for national survival that would transform him from a domestic dictator into a world leader, and set the stage for him to lose the war for China itself. The period from 1928 to 1937 is known in history as the Nanjing Decade. On the surface, it was Chiang Kai-shek's golden age. With China nominally unified under his rule, he presided over an ambitious program of state building and modernization. His government, staffed by a new generation of Western-educated technocrats, built railways and highways, established a modern central bank and a stable national currency, expanded the public education system, and codified a new legal system. China, for the first time in a century, seemed to be on the path to stability and progress. At the center of this new world was Sun Meiling. As the First Lady, she was a symbol of this modernizing impulse. She championed her New Life movement, a campaign to instill discipline and hygiene in the populace. Appointed by her husband to lead the Aeronautical Commission, she became the powerful and influential face of the nascent Chinese Air Force, seeing air power as the key to a modern military. She was her husband's indispensable bridge to the West, but this gilded age was a fragile facade. Beneath the veneer of progress, Chiang's kingdom was rotting from within. His power, won through military force and political maneuvering, was never absolute. The warlords he had conquered had often just been co-opted, retaining their private armies and regional autonomy. His own Kuomintang party was a snake pit of competing factions, and his regime rested on a foundation of systemic corruption that would become its fatal flaw. To secure his power, Chiang had made deals with regional militarists, Shanghai gangsters, and powerful banking families, like his wife's. This created a vast network of patronage and graft. Government positions were bought and sold. Public funds vanished into private pockets. The four big families, the Chiangs, the Sungs, the Kungs, and the Chens, were widely seen as treating the national economy as their personal fiefdom. Chiang himself was personally incorruptible, living a Spartan, disciplined life, but he tolerated and even protected the corruption of his subordinates as long as they remained loyal to him. For him, loyalty was the only virtue that truly mattered. To enforce that loyalty, he created a terrifying instrument of political control, the Bureau of Investigation and Statistics, a vast secret police network led by his shadowy spy master, Dai Li. Informally known as the Blue Shirts, they were a quasi-fascist organization modeled on Mussolini's Black Shirts, a secret army loyal only to Chiang. They hunted down communists, liberal intellectuals, and anyone critical of the regime. Abductions, torture, and assassinations became common tools of state policy. This was the White Terror, a reign of fear that silenced dissent and revealed the brutal authoritarian heart of his government. While Chiang was building his new capital, his mortal enemy was not idle. Mao Zedong and the shattered remnants of the Communist Party, having survived the 1927 massacre, had fled to the remote mountainous countryside of Jiangxi province. There, they had established their own state within a state, the Chinese Soviet Republic. They were building a new kind of army, a peasant Red Army, and winning the support of the rural population with a simple, powerful promise: land reform. Chiang Kai-shek was obsessed with this communist bandit problem. He viewed them not as a political opposition, but as a cancerous tumor that had to be excised before the nation could be healthy. He famously declared, "The Japanese are a disease of the skin, but the communists are a disease of the heart." This single phrase defined his priorities for the next decade. From 1930 to 1934, he launched a series of 5 massive encirclement campaigns, pouring hundreds of thousands of his best troops and the nation's scarce resources into a brutal war of annihilation against the Jiangxi Soviet. It was a vicious civil war, a conflict that pitted Chinese against Chinese. Mao's Red Army, outnumbered and outgunned, used masterful guerrilla tactics to fend off the first 4 campaigns. But by the 5th campaign, Chiang, now advised by German military experts, had adopted a slow, methodical strategy of building blockhouses and tightening the noose. The communists were trapped, facing starvation and total annihilation. In October 1934, they made a desperate choice. They broke out of the encirclement and began an epic, year-long fighting retreat across the length of China. This was the legendary Long March, a 6,000-mile odyssey of unimaginable hardship that would become the foundational myth of Chinese communism. Of the 80,000 who began the march, only a few thousand survived to reach their new remote base in Yan'an. Chiang believed he had finally broken the back of his enemy. He had driven them to the brink of extinction, but he had made 2 fatal errors. He had failed to deliver the final blow. The survivors of the Long March, forged in the crucible of extreme hardship, would form the hardened core of a new, more powerful Red Army. And, more fatefully, while he had been obsessively focused on this internal disease, he had ignored the far greater threat gathering on his doorstep. While Chiang was pouring his military might into fighting Mao, the Empire of Japan was on the move. In 1931, using a staged incident as a pretext, the Japanese army invaded and occupied Manchuria, a vast and resource-rich territory in northeastern China. In a move that shocked the world, Chiang Kai-shek ordered his troops not to resist. His policy of first internal pacification, then external resistance, was, in his mind, a cold strategic calculation. He believed that his army was not yet ready to confront the might of Japan. He hoped that the League of Nations and international diplomacy would force Japan to withdraw. And he remained convinced that the communists were the greater, more immediate threat. But to the Chinese people, his policy looked like unforgivable cowardice. A wave of furious, patriotic protests swept the nation. Students took to the streets, demanding that Chiang stop the civil war and fight the Japanese. The public was outraged that their government seemed more interested in killing fellow Chinese than in defending the nation from a foreign invader. Chiang's prestige, so high after the northern expedition, plummeted. The unifier of China was now seen by many as a weak leader who was failing to protect the homeland. This simmering national rage finally boiled over in the most dramatic way imaginable, in the bizarre and pivotal event known as the Xi'an Incident. In December 1936, Chiang flew to the city of Xi'an to oversee the final push against the communists. The troops assigned to this task were the Manchurian army of the young marshal, Zhang Xueliang, the very men who had been driven from their homes by the Japanese. They had no stomach for fighting a civil war while their homeland was under occupation. Their commander, Zhang, had secretly been in contact with the communists and had become convinced that a united front against Japan was the only path forward. On the morning of December 12th, in an act of stunning insubordination, Zhang's troops stormed Chiang's headquarters. The Generalissimo, caught in his nightclothes, was captured after a frantic attempt to escape up a nearby hill. The leader of China was now a hostage, held by his own general with a single demand: stop the civil war and lead the nation against Japan. The crisis pushed China to the brink of collapse. Hardliners in the government wanted to bomb Xi'an, a move that would have certainly killed Chiang. It was improbably the intervention of the communists, led by Zhou Enlai, and the dramatic arrival of Sun Meiling that brokered a deal. After 13 days of tense negotiations, Chiang was released. He never signed a formal agreement, but he had given his word. He would end the active pursuit of the communists and form a second united front to resist Japan. The Xi'an incident was a profound personal humiliation for Chiang Kai-shek. He had been shamed by his own subordinate, but ironically, it may have saved him politically. It forced him to adopt the one policy the entire nation was demanding. The kidnapping forced his hand publicly, compelling him to act sooner than he may have intended, and transforming him from the pursuer of a divisive civil war into the reluctant leader of a national war of resistance. The reluctant dragon had finally been prodded into facing the true enemy. The ensuing invasion would plunge China into its darkest hour, a brutal 8-year struggle for survival. This was the crucible that would forge Chiang's global reputation, placing him alongside Roosevelt and Churchill. However, the immense pressure of total war would also expose the deepest flaws in his leadership, from his controversial military strategies to the venomous feud with his own American chief of staff, sowing the very seeds of his ultimate defeat. The fragile peace brokered in the dramatic aftermath of the Xi'an incident lasted barely 6 months. The Second United Front between the nationalists and the communists had forced a temporary sullen unity upon China, but it had also been a red flag to the militant expansionists within the Japanese government and military. They saw a unifying China as a direct threat to their ambitions of creating a Japanese-dominated Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The window for a swift, decisive conquest was closing. They needed a pretext to launch a full-scale war, and in the summer of 1937, they found one. The spark came on the night of July 7, 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge, a historic stone bridge spanning the Yongding River just west of Beijing. Japanese troops who were stationed in the area under the terms of a previous unequal treaty were conducting night maneuvers. They claimed that one of their soldiers had gone missing and that they had heard shots fired from the Chinese-held town of Wanping. Demanding the right to enter the town and search for their missing soldier, a clear violation of Chinese sovereignty, they were refused by the local Chinese garrison. Shots were exchanged. The incident itself was minor, likely orchestrated by local Japanese field commanders, but it was the casus belli the Japanese army had been waiting for. Despite attempts at a local truce, the Japanese military command in Tokyo used the incident to escalate dramatically. By the end of July, they had launched a full-scale invasion of northern China, capturing Beijing and the major port city of Tianjin. The Japanese high command was supremely confident. They believed that their modern, mechanized army, tempered by a decade of conflict in Manchuria, would crush the poorly equipped and politically divided Chinese forces within 3 months. Their plan was to deliver a swift, devastating blow that would force Chiang Kai-shek's government to capitulate and accept Japanese hegemony. They had catastrophically misjudged the new mood in China. The years of humiliation and the shock of the Xi'an incident had forged a new, defiant nationalism. This time, China would not back down. This time, China would fight. Chiang Kai-shek was now the leader of a united China, the Generalissimo of a national war of resistance. He stood as a symbol of defiance against a seemingly invincible foe. The world, which had once viewed him as just another warlord, now saw him as a great statesman. The American magazine Time named him Man of the Year in 1937. He was for a time one of the most admired leaders on the planet. Chiang Kai-shek, understanding that his northern armies were no match for the Japanese, decided to open a second front. He shifted the focus of the war away from the northern plains and to the great international metropolis of Shanghai. It was a strategic masterstroke born of desperation. By fighting in Shanghai, a city with massive Western economic interests and a large international population, he hoped to draw the attention and perhaps even the intervention of the Western powers. He would show the world that China was not going to surrender. He would force them to watch. In August 1937, Chiang threw his very best German-trained divisions into the battle. What the Japanese expected to be a quick mop-up operation turned into a brutal 3-month meat grinder, one of the first great urban battles of the 20th century. The fighting was savage, with block-by-block, hand-to-hand combat in the dense urban landscape. The Chinese soldiers, though outgunned in artillery and air power, fought with suicidal courage, stunning the Japanese and the world with the ferocity of their resistance. But courage was not enough. After 3 months of horrific casualties, with the Chinese army bled white and the Japanese bringing in massive naval and army reinforcements, Shanghai fell in November 1937. The path to the capital, Nanjing, now lay open. The fall of Shanghai broke the back of China's best armies. The retreat to Nanjing turned into a chaotic and disorganized rout. The city, which Chiang Kai-shek had vowed to defend to the last man, was left poorly defended and teeming with terrified civilians and leaderless soldiers. Sung Mei-ling, Chiang, and the government were forced to flee, beginning a long, westward exodus deep into the Chinese interior. In December 1937, the Japanese Central China Area Army, under the nominal command of General Iwane Matsui, but effectively directed on the ground by Prince Asaka, captured Nanjing. What followed was one of the most horrific atrocities of the modern era, an event that would be seared into the collective memory of the Chinese people as the rape of Nanjing. For 6 to 8 weeks, the victorious Japanese soldiers were unleashed on the captured city in an orgy of murder, rape, looting, and arson. Tens of thousands of unarmed Chinese soldiers who had surrendered were summarily executed in mass killings. Civilians were hunted down and slaughtered by the thousands. An estimated 20,000 to 80,000 women and girls, from young children to elderly grandmothers, were subjected to systematic rape and sexual torture by Japanese soldiers. Many were brutally murdered afterward. The city was looted and then burned, with roughly 1/3 of its buildings destroyed. A small group of brave Western expatriates, doctors, missionaries, and businessmen, including the German Nazi Party member John Raby, remained in the city and established an international safety zone, desperately trying to shelter a few 100,000 refugees. Their diaries and letters, smuggled out of the city, provided the world with horrifying first-hand accounts of the slaughter. The estimated death toll ranges from a conservative 40,000 to over 300,000. For the Chinese people, Nanjing became an unforgivable symbol of Japanese brutality, a national trauma that echoes to this day. As Nanjing burned, the Chinese government was in full flight. The exodus westward was an epic of human misery and national resilience. They moved first to the city of Wuhan, which became the temporary capital for nearly a year. But as the Japanese armies advanced up the Yangtze River, the government was forced to move again, this time embarking on a perilous journey deep into the remote mountainous interior. Their final destination was Chongqing, a city perched on a rocky promontory at the confluence of the Yangtze and Jialing rivers in Sichuan province. It was a city of fog, steep hills, and strategic isolation. Protected by the treacherous Yangtze gorges, it was almost impossible to attack by land. It would become China's wartime capital for the next 8 years, a symbol of free China and stubborn resistance. This was a retreat on an almost unimaginable scale. The government orchestrated the forced march of an entire industrial base. Factories were dismantled, machinery loaded onto barges, and pulled by hand up the treacherous river rapids. Universities were relocated with professors and students carrying precious books and laboratory equipment on their backs for thousands of miles. Millions of ordinary citizens fled the Japanese advance, becoming a river of refugees flowing westward. Chiang's strategy was brutal and simple: trade space for time. He would use China's vast territory as his greatest weapon, drawing the Japanese deeper into the country, stretching their supply lines and bogging them down in a war of attrition he believed they could not win. It was a strategy that would save his government from collapse, but it would come at a staggering cost in human lives. In the desperate, grinding war of resistance, Chiang Kai-shek was capable of acts of astonishing courage and defiance, but he was also capable of decisions of appalling ruthlessness, decisions that treated the lives of his own people as expendable pawns on a vast military chessboard. The most controversial and devastating of these decisions came in the summer of 1938. The Japanese armies, having consolidated their control of the north, were advancing rapidly across the North China Plain, heading for the crucial railway junction of Zhengzhou and the temporary capital of Wuhan. Chiang's armies were in retreat and unable to stop them. In a desperate bid to halt the Japanese advance, he authorized a plan of almost unimaginable scale and horror. On June 9, 1938, he ordered his engineers to dynamite the dikes of the Yellow River. The Yellow River, known as China's Sorrow, was one of the world's most powerful and unpredictable rivers, prone to catastrophic flooding. By deliberately breaching its southern levees, Chiang intended to create a massive artificial flood to bog down the Japanese army and buy time for the defense of Wuhan. The military objective was, to a limited extent, achieved. The sudden massive flood did surprise the Japanese, forcing them to divert their axis of attack and delaying their capture of Wuhan by several months. But the human cost was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. A torrent of water, silt, and debris surged across the flat, densely populated plains of Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu provinces. It did not just flood the land, it changed the very course of the river, creating a vast, swampy inland sea that covered an area the size of Belgium. Thousands of villages were instantly submerged. The official death toll given by the nationalist government was a gross underestimate. Modern historians believe that anywhere from 500,000 to nearly 900,000 Chinese civilians were drowned in the initial flood. And that was only the beginning. The flood destroyed millions of acres of fertile farmland, wiping out crops and creating a famine that would kill millions more in the years to come. It created an estimated 4 to 10 million desperate refugees who were forced to flee their homes with nothing, spreading disease and starvation wherever they went. To many historians, the 1938 Yellow River flood stands as one of the most horrific acts of environmental warfare in history, a clear indication that Chiang Kai-shek was a leader willing to sacrifice his own people on a massive scale to achieve a military objective. He did not just break the dikes, he unchained a dragon and unleashed it upon his own people to slow the advance of another. It was an act of terrible godlike calculus, a decision to sacrifice a province to save a regime. The Yellow River flood was not an isolated incident. Later that same year, another tragedy born of paranoia and incompetence would further alienate the people from the government. As the Japanese advanced on the city of Changsha in November 1938, a scorched earth policy was approved. The city would be deliberately burned to the ground before retreating, denying the Japanese any resources or shelter. The order was to be given only when the enemy was at the city gates, but in a catastrophic failure of command and communication, panicked local units set the fires prematurely while the city was still full of its own citizens and retreating nationalist soldiers. The fire raged for 3 days, destroying over 90% of the city and killing an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 people. It was a self-inflicted wound, a horrific blunder that killed more Chinese civilians than the ensuing battle with the Japanese. While Chiang bore the ultimate political responsibility for the disaster, the Changsha fire became another symbol of the KMT government's incompetence and its callous disregard for the lives of its own people. While waging this brutal war against the Japanese, Chiang never fully took his eye off his other, more intimate enemy. The Second United Front with the Communists was, from the very beginning, a fiction, a marriage of convenience riddled with deep-seated suspicion and constant betrayal. While the bulk of Chiang's conventional armies were tied down in massive set-piece battles against the Japanese army, suffering enormous casualties, Mao Zedong's communist forces were playing a very different and far more cunning game. Mao's strategy, which he laid out in secret directives to his commanders, was clear. 70% expansion, 20% dealing with the Kuomintang, and 10% resisting Japan. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, and he knew his peasant army was no match for the Japanese in a conventional fight, so he largely avoided it. Instead, his 8th Route Army and New 4th Army would move into the rural areas behind Japanese lines. They would establish guerrilla bases, harass Japanese supply lines, and, most importantly, begin the political work of winning over the peasantry. While the KMT government, far away in Chongqing, was seen as corrupt and ineffective, the communist cadres on the ground were seen as disciplined, honest, and dedicated to helping the common people. They reduced rents, organized village defenses, and established a reputation as the true defenders of the nation. Mao was letting his two greatest enemies, Chiang and the Japanese, bleed each other dry, while he preserved his own strength and massively expanded his political and military control over the countryside. He was fighting a brilliant political war under the cover of a national war of resistance. Chiang was acutely aware of this, and it filled him with a cold fury. He saw Mao's strategy as a craven act of betrayal, an opportunistic exploitation of the national crisis. It fueled his paranoia and his conviction that the communists were, and always would be, the disease of the heart. Even as he was fighting the Japanese, he devoted hundreds of thousands of his best troops not to the front lines, but to a tight blockade of the communist base in Yan'an, a massive diversion of resources that infuriated his American allies. The simmering conflict between the two allies occasionally boiled over into open fighting. The most notorious incident came in 1941 in what became known as the New Fourth Army Incident. Nationalist forces ambushed and decimated a large column of communist troops who were supposedly relocating under the terms of the United Front Agreement. Thousands of communist soldiers were killed or captured. The incident brought the United Front to the brink of total collapse and cemented the communist view of Chiang as a treacherous and untrustworthy leader. The war against Japan was in reality a three-way war, a complex and bloody chess game where every player was fighting for their own survival. On December 7, 1941, the war in China was transformed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, while a devastating blow to the United States, was a moment of profound joy and relief for Chiang Kai-shek. He had been fighting alone for 4.5 long years. Now the world's greatest industrial power was his official ally. China's status was instantly elevated. Chiang was appointed the supreme commander of Allied forces in the China theater. American aid, which had been a trickle, was now promised as a flood, and Chiang himself was elevated to the status of a world leader. His international prestige, largely thanks to his wife's brilliant diplomacy and the powerful advocacy of figures like publisher Henry Luce, reached its absolute zenith. He was no longer just a Chinese general. He was a global statesman, one of the big four leaders of the Allied cause. The peak of this prestige came in November 1943, when he and Sung Mei-ling traveled to Egypt for the Cairo Conference. There, they sat as equals alongside President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill to plan the final defeat of Japan and to shape the post-war world. For a leader of a nation that had endured a century of humiliation, it was a moment of immense personal and national pride. With Mei-ling acting as his indispensable translator and advisor, Chiang secured a major victory. The Allies' public promise that all Chinese territory seized by Japan, including Manchuria, and crucially Taiwan, would be returned to China after the war. But this grand alliance, so promising on the surface, was plagued from the very beginning by deep-seated cultural misunderstandings, strategic disagreements, and a profound clash of personalities. And no relationship was more toxic or more consequential than the venomous feud between Chiang Kai-shek and his own American chief of staff. In 1942, the United States had sent one of its most experienced and toughest generals to China. His name was Joseph W. Stilwell, and he was, in every conceivable way, the anti-Chiang Kai-shek. Stilwell was a career infantryman, a West Point graduate who had served multiple tours in China and spoke fluent, if coarse, Chinese. He was blunt, irascible, and had no time for diplomatic niceties or the pomp and flattery of Chongqing's high society. His nickname was Vinegar Joe, and it was well earned. He was a soldier's soldier who preferred the mud of the front lines in Burma to the comfort of the capital. He had been sent with a clear mission: to reform the Chinese army, whip it into a modern fighting force, and lead it in an aggressive campaign to retake Burma and reopen the land supply route. From the moment he arrived, he clashed spectacularly with the reality of Chiang's China. He was appalled by what he saw. He saw a military command structure based on personal loyalty rather than competence. He saw generals who falsified troop numbers to pocket the pay of non-existent ghost soldiers. He saw soldiers who were treated worse than animals, often left to starve by their corrupt commanders, while officers hoarded and sold supplies on the black market. Most of all, he saw Chiang Kai-shek's maddening obsession with hoarding his best American-equipped troops, not to fight the Japanese, but to blockade the communists in the north, saving them for the Civil War. He planned to fight after the World War was over. Stilwell developed a deep, visceral, and venomous contempt for Chiang Kai-shek, whom he derisively nicknamed the Peanut in his private diaries, which he filled with scathing and often profane critiques of the Generalissimo's leadership. He saw him as a petty, incompetent, and paranoid dictator who was fundamentally incapable of leading a modern war. And he reserved a special, unique disdain for Madame Chiang, whom he saw as the manipulative empress who cleverly concealed the rot of her husband's kingdom from her gullible American admirers. The feud between the two men became a debilitating cancer at the heart of the Sino-American alliance. Chiang saw Stilwell as an arrogant, insubordinate foreigner who sought to usurp his command and effectively colonize his army. Stilwell saw Chiang as a corrupt obstructionist who was wasting American lives and treasure. The conflict came to a spectacular and destructive climax in 1944. Frustrated by years of inaction and a series of military debacles, Stilwell used his direct line to Washington to convince President Roosevelt to make an unprecedented demand. FDR, losing patience, sent a blunt message to Chiang Kai-shek, effectively an ultimatum, demanding that he place General Stilwell in unrestricted command of all Chinese forces. For Chiang, this was the ultimate insult, the final humiliation. It confirmed his worst fears about American intentions. He refused, framing his refusal as a stand for national dignity and sovereignty. Song Mei-ling marshaled all of her political capital, working furiously behind the scenes to lobby her powerful friends in Washington against Stilwell. Chiang had won the power struggle. Faced with his absolute refusal, President Roosevelt was forced to back down. In October 1944, Joseph Stilwell was recalled from China. It was a major political victory for Chiang Kai-shek. He had faced down the American president and won. He had won the battle for his own authority, but he had done so by allowing his wife to set fire to the very bridge of trust she had so painstakingly built to America. The Stilwell affair was not just a diplomatic incident. It was an act of strategic arson that left him isolated on his own burning continent. The myth that Song Mei-ling had so carefully constructed in 1943 was irrevocably shattered. In August 1945, the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered. 8 long, brutal years of war were finally over. On paper, China was a victorious power. It had withstood the full might of the Japanese army and was granted a permanent seat on the newly formed United Nations Security Council. It should have been Chiang Kai-shek's moment of ultimate triumph, but the victory was hollow. The war had left China bankrupt and exhausted, with an estimated 15 to 20 million dead. His government was morally bankrupt, and his armies were demoralized. And his mortal enemy, Mao Zedong, was stronger than ever. The war against Japan had been the greatest gift Chiang could have given him. While the KMT had bled itself white fighting the Japanese, the communists had expanded their control over the countryside, built a battle-hardened army of nearly 1 million men, and won the loyalty of tens of millions of peasants. The war against the foreign invader was over. Now, the final brutal war for the soul of China was about to begin. In this last tragic chapter, the dynasty falls. We will witness the spectacular downfall of the nationalist regime, a defeat born not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. We will follow Chiang on his desperate flight to Taiwan and see the final unresolved reckoning of his vast and deeply contradictory legacy. The surrender of Japan did not bring peace, it merely cleared the battlefield. The moment the common enemy was defeated, the simmering civil war erupted with a ferocity that stunned the world. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic race. Both KMT and CCP forces scrambled to accept the surrender of Japanese troops, not out of administrative duty, but to seize their weapons, equipment, and most importantly, the territory they occupied. Into this volatile landscape stepped the United States, desperate to prevent a full-blown civil war that it feared would create a power vacuum for the Soviet Union to exploit. In December 1945, President Truman dispatched one of America's most revered figures, General of the Army George C. Marshall, on a seemingly impossible mission to broker a truce and forge a coalition government between the two mortal enemies. For a time, there was a glimmer of hope. Marshall, a man of immense integrity and patience, managed to bring Chiang and Mao's representatives to the negotiating table. A ceasefire was announced in January 1946, and plans were drawn up for a unified national army and a new constitution. Sung Mei-ling played a crucial role during this period, hosting elegant dinners for the American delegation and acting as the primary translator and facilitator in the tense negotiations between her husband and Marshall. She deployed the full force of her charm, trying to convince the Americans of her husband's sincerity while simultaneously trying to manage Chiang's deep-seated paranoia and inflexibility. But the truce was an illusion. The two sides were irreconcilable, their visions for China's future fundamentally incompatible. Chiang, supremely confident in his military superiority, saw the negotiations as a stalling tactic, a way to consolidate his power before launching a final decisive campaign to annihilate the communists. Mao, in turn, saw the talks as a way to win legitimacy, buy time to strengthen his own forces, and expose the KMT's unwillingness to embrace true democracy. The mutual distrust was absolute. By the summer of 1946, the ceasefire had completely collapsed. The Marshall Mission was a failure, and full-scale civil war, a conflict that would prove to be one of the most consequential of the 20th century, engulfed the nation. The Chinese Civil War was not just a military conflict. It was a battle of ideas and a contest for the people's loyalty. On paper, it was a contest that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists should have won easily. The KMT army was at least 3 times the size of the communist force. It was equipped with billions of dollars worth of modern American weapons, trucks, and aircraft, much of it surplus from World War II. It controlled all of China's major cities, its entire industrial base, and its central government, which was recognized by the world as the sole legitimate authority. But this material superiority masked a fatal moral and spiritual bankruptcy. The same corruption that had plagued the war effort against Japan now ran rampant and unchecked. When the nationalist officials returned to the cities that had been occupied by the Japanese, they were not greeted as liberators. They behaved like a new army of occupation. They seized property, extorted businesses, and treated the local population with contempt, viewing anyone who had survived under the Japanese as a potential traitor or collaborator. The 8 years of war had not purified the Kuomintang. It had made it more rapacious, more desperate. The economy, already shattered by war, completely collapsed under the weight of the government's incompetence and greed. To fund his massive army, Chiang printed money with reckless abandon. The result was hyperinflation on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Prices doubled, then quadrupled, then rose by the hour. People's life savings, painstakingly accumulated over generations, were wiped out in a matter of weeks. The value of money evaporated almost instantly. A salary received in the morning was worth only half by lunchtime and was utterly useless by dinner. The urban middle class, the doctors, teachers, and small business owners, who should have been the bedrock of a modern republic, was utterly destroyed. Their loyalty to the government evaporated along with their savings. Meanwhile, a tiny elite at the top grew obscenely wealthy. The 4 big families, the Chiangs, the Sungs, the Kungs, and the Chens, were widely seen as using their political power to speculate on currency and funnel vast fortunes into their own overseas bank accounts. The perception was that while the nation starved, the ruling dynasty was getting rich. In stark contrast, Mao Zedong's communists held decisive advantages. First, their People's Liberation Army was a disciplined, highly motivated, and politically indoctrinated force. While KMT soldiers were often demoralized conscripts who were poorly fed and led, the PLA soldiers were fighting for a cause they believed in. They were known for their iron discipline and respectful treatment of the civilian population, a stark contrast to the predatory behavior of many KMT units. Second, and most devastatingly, Mao had a simple and incredibly powerful message for the 80% of the population who were peasants: land reform. The message was revolutionary. The land belongs to those who work it. For hundreds of millions of peasants, this was not a political slogan. It was a promise of liberation from centuries of oppression. The CCP's land reform policies, while often brutal in their implementation against landlords, won them the fervent, unwavering support of the masses. Mao had lost the cities, but he had won the countryside. He had won the people. In the eyes of many Chinese, he had won the mandate of heaven. Third, Mao held a decisive material advantage. In Manchuria, the Soviet Union handed over the massive surrendered arsenal of Japan's Kwantung Army directly to his forces. As her husband's empire began to crumble with terrifying speed, Sung Meiling embarked on one last, desperate mission to save it. In December 1948, with the military situation now catastrophic, she flew to Washington to plead for a massive, immediate program of emergency aid. The visit was a sad and bitter echo of her triumphant 1943 tour. The magic was gone. She was no longer greeted as a conquering heroine, the symbol of a noble cause. She was now seen as the representative of a failed, corrupt, and collapsing state. The Truman administration, which had received years of scathing reports about KMT corruption and military incompetence, had grown weary of pouring money into what Secretary of State Dean Acheson would later call a rat hole. Her meeting with President Truman was a disaster. He received her with cold, formal indifference. When she made her plea for billions in aid and direct U.S. military support, he flatly refused. The American government had concluded that the KMT was a lost cause, and no amount of money or weapons could save a regime that had so completely lost the support of its own people. The woman who had once held the U.S. Congress in the palm of her hand was now a supplicant, forced to wait in the cold antechambers of power. The press, which had once lionized her, was now critical and skeptical. She left Washington empty-handed, humiliated, and facing the stark reality that her great life's work, the Sino-American alliance she had so carefully built, was over. Her American education and her flawless charm, her greatest assets, had finally failed her. While Meiling was in Washington, the military collapse on the mainland became total and absolute. The end came with a speed that shocked even the most pessimistic observers. The decisive battles were fought in late 1948 and early 1949. In the Manchurian campaign, the brilliant communist General Lin Biao surrounded and systematically annihilated the KMT's best American-trained armies. Nearly 500,000 of Chiang's elite troops were lost. This was followed by the epic Huaihai campaign, one of the largest and most decisive battles of the 20th century. In a 65-day struggle involving more than 1 million soldiers on both sides, the Communists again outmaneuvered and encircled a massive KMT force. The result was another catastrophic defeat for the Nationalists, with another 500,000 men killed, captured, or defecting. The Nationalist armies did not just lose, they disintegrated. Entire divisions, complete with their American-made tanks, artillery, and rifles, would surrender to the Communists without firing a single shot. The flow of defections became a flood. The PLA wryly referred to Chiang Kai-shek as their quartermaster, as so much of their modern equipment came from KMT soldiers who simply laid down their arms and switched sides. By the spring of 1949, the KMT's military machine had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. With the communists sweeping south toward the Yangtze River, the end was near. Chiang Kai-shek, his government, and the remnants of his loyal followers began to plan a desperate, last-ditch retreat. Their destination was a small mountainous island that had recently been returned to China after 50 years of Japanese rule, Taiwan. The exodus was a chaotic and tragic spectacle. From late 1948 through 1949, a massive airlift and sealift operation commenced. The KMT began systematically stripping the mainland of its assets. Crate after crate of China's vast gold and foreign currency reserves were loaded onto ships and planes and spirited away to the island. Priceless art treasures from the Forbidden City and the National Museum, bronzes, jades, porcelains, and paintings representing 5,000 years of Chinese civilization were packed up and shipped across the strait, a cultural evacuation on an epic scale. They were followed by a river of humanity. An estimated 2 million people, soldiers, politicians, bureaucrats, businessmen, intellectuals, and their families, fled the mainland for the island refuge. They boarded crowded, rickety ships and overloaded planes, leaving behind their homes, their histories, and their homeland, perhaps forever. It was the fall of a dynasty, a desperate flight from the judgment of a revolution that had finally consumed them. The arrival in Taiwan in 1949 was not a strategic relocation. It was a desperate, humiliating retreat. For the 2 million mainlanders who flooded onto the island, Taiwan was not a promised land. It was a last refuge, a final redoubt against the communist tide. The subtropical island, which they had only nominally governed since 1945, was a place of exile, a temporary stepping stone for the dream of a triumphant return to the mainland, a dream that would become a lifelong delusion. The atmosphere among the defeated nationalists was a toxic brew of shock, denial, and recrimination. For the 7 million native Taiwanese, the arrival of the KMT was not a liberation but the replacement of one colonial master with another. The tension between the newcomers and the locals was immediate and explosive, and it had already erupted into a foundational trauma that would define Taiwanese politics for the next half-century. The 228 incident of 1947, a brutal crackdown on a local uprising that saw tens of thousands of Taiwanese elites killed by KMT troops. It was a bloody dress rehearsal for what was to come. Haunted by his failure, Chiang concluded that he had lost the mainland because he had not been ruthless enough. In Taiwan, he would not make that mistake again. He imposed a state of martial law that would last for 38 years. This began the era of the White Terror, a long and brutal period of political repression. The island became a fortress, a police state where anyone suspected of being a communist or a dissident was imprisoned or executed. But paradoxically, it was on this small island, under the iron fist of his dictatorship, that Chiang finally achieved some of the successes that had eluded him on the mainland. His most crucial reform was one he had failed to implement on the mainland: land reform. Implemented with critical expertise and support from the American-led Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, the program known as Land to the Tiller forced large landlords to sell their excess land to the state, which then resold it to tenant farmers on easy terms. It was, ironically, a policy very similar to the one that had brought Mao to power. The reform was a stunning success. It created a new class of prosperous, independent farmers, stabilized the countryside, and laid the foundation for future economic growth. That growth was supercharged by the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. Suddenly, Taiwan was no longer a lost cause. It was a vital anti-communist ally, an unsinkable aircraft carrier in America's Cold War strategy. The U.S. 7th Fleet was sent to protect the island, and massive amounts of American aid began to flow in. With this aid, and under a state-led model of development, Taiwan's economy took off. The government invested heavily in education and light industry. The result was the Taiwan Miracle. In a single generation, this small, resource-poor island was transformed into one of the world's leading export economies, one of the 4 Asian tigers. The dictator who had presided over economic collapse on the mainland had, through a strange alchemy of authoritarian control and American patronage, become the architect of a capitalist success story. His final years were marked by a slow, painful slide into international irrelevance. He clung to the fiction that he was the legitimate ruler of all of China, dreaming of a return to the mainland that everyone knew would never come. The world, however, moved on. The final devastating blow came from his staunchest ally, the United States. In 1972, President Richard Nixon, in a stunning geopolitical reversal, traveled to Beijing and shook hands with Mao Zedong. The images of Nixon and Mao toasting in the Great Hall of the People were a public execution of Chiang's dream. The United States was tilting towards Beijing, and Taiwan was being cast adrift. In 1971, his Republic of China had been expelled from the United Nations, its seat given to Mao's People's Republic. Chiang Kai-shek, now old and frail, watched these events unfold from his residence in Taipei in stunned disbelief. It was the ultimate betrayal. The world he had known, the alliances he had built his life upon, were dissolving before his eyes. On April 5, 1975, after a long illness, Chiang Kai-shek died at the age of 87. The man who had ruled China and then Taiwan for nearly half a century was gone. An era had officially ended. He died a defeated man, his great dream of a unified non-communist China in ruins, his lost homeland, a place he would never see again. His body was placed in a temporary mausoleum in Taiwan, awaiting the day it could be buried on the mainland. It remains there to this day. So, how should history remember Chiang Kai-shek? His legacy is a massive and unsettling contradiction. In Taiwan, he is remembered by some as a national hero, the man who protected the island from communism and laid the groundwork for its economic miracle. To others, especially the victims of his long reign of terror, he is the brutal dictator of the White Terror. In mainland China, he was long reviled as a corrupt villain, but in recent years, his reputation has been partially rehabilitated, recognized for his role, however flawed, in unifying the country and leading the resistance against Japan. Perhaps the most fitting way to see him is as a man of his time, a deeply traditional Confucian figure who was thrust into the violent chaos of the modern age. He was a patriot who sought to build a strong and unified China, but his vision was that of an authoritarian, a man who believed in order and discipline, not democracy and freedom. He was a master of political survival, a ruthless and cunning operator who outmaneuvered countless rivals. But he was also a flawed strategist and a poor judge of the popular will, a leader who never truly understood the aspirations of the people he sought to rule. His life was a great tragedy. He fought his entire life to save China, only to be defeated by a revolution that promised to save it more completely. He was the brutal surgeon who successfully cut the cancer of warlordism from the nation's body, only to watch the patient die from the gangrene of his own corruption. His legacy is not a statue in a public square. It is the colossal foundational ruin upon which the entire fractured story of modern China was built.